It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
All right, folks, here we are. Welcome back to the program. Thanks so much for being with us. And we want to welcome, as always, we got Mr. Dan Sullivan back with us in studio. Thanks, Dan.
Hi, Paul. Glad to be here.
How was your Christmas and your New Year?
Had a really good one.
Good.
I retired in December of last year, so I've had a relaxing year and really an opportunity to dig into legislative issues more, study a little bit more about the upcoming session,
Yep.
and I'm ready to go.
Good. Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm going to turn your microphone up. Okay, so let's talk about the session. What are you looking forward to?
Well, I'm personally going to run probably more legislation than I've run in the past. Usually I have just 2 or 3 bills I'm really behind. I've got 6 or 7 right now, and all of them are geared towards reducing regulation, cutting our spending, and trying to find programs where we're spending a lot of money and not really getting a lot out of it. A good example is the all-payer claim system. Senator David Sanders, ran it a few years ago, and our last session, and it failed in the House, failed in the Senate, failed in the House again, passed in the Senate, and then passed in the House. And we're spending millions of dollars, and there are no outcomes. They're supposed to be studying how we can save money on health care, if you can believe that. But I'm not aware of any recommendations or any data that they've produced that actually save us money. And I think we spend anywhere from $3 to $10 or $12 million. And there have to be multiple programs just like that if legislators will dig in, we can find ways to cut the waste, cut the spending, and reduce the size of government.
Okay, so this particular program, say this again, this was something to try to find, you spend money to try to find savings, and when we don't ever find savings, we just spend the money.
We just spend the money, right. And it's not that it's a bad idea. The concept is a good concept. Let's really study the data, and I'm all for that. However, we are cutting services to our disabled. We're cutting services to some of our elder programs. We are holding flat spending on things like our senior centers. So it's really how we prioritize how we spend the money. It's not just cutting for cutting's sake. It's saying, here are the important things. Here's where we need to be spending money. And let's make sure we're prioritizing appropriately.
What was your reaction? I don't think we've talked to you since we had, I think it was in the middle of December, we had the news that there were going to be massive cuts to reimbursements in the Medicaid, in the traditional Medicaid program. These cuts were forecast kind of back in 2015, but it's only now that they're being
you
realized.
had some excellent points on that, Paul. That the governor had said that in order to fund Medicaid expansion, we necessarily are going to have to find savings.
Right.
Well, the real word for that is cuts, and that's not a bad thing necessarily, but we cut from the people who most need our services and who we as legislators should hold as a priority. So we're paying, I think, $138 million now for the expansion. Next year, in this budget we're going to pass, we'll be paying $68 million. And the following year, $219 million. That money comes right out of the budget and is going to able-bodied, working-age adults with no kids, and rather than prioritize the people who are most important.
It's absolutely, it's interesting that this is kind of where we are. It's 2019 now, and the bill, I guess, has come due. Is that really what's going on here?
Exactly, and we all knew that. That wasn't a surprise. People admitted they wanted the money now. And for example, our people in education, our teachers, that money, rather than going to our schools, we have to hold budgets flat. We have to hold other budgets flat or cut money. I think you had this clip also. The director of DHS said that we'll have to come back later and find additional savings to pay for Medicaid expansion. So it's still a big deal. I doubt if we're going to be able to walk that back this session. What's done is done. We're going to have to find other more free market answers to save the money. I've fought for 2 years now to have telehealth incorporated. Pardon me. to have advanced practice nurse legislation passed. And for the first time, the governor has weighed in supporting advanced practice nurses.
That's good.
Yeah, he hasn't done so officially, but we passed legislation that allows advanced practice nurses to be a primary care provider in a behavioral health facility. So if it works for them, it ought to work for all the people and give people some choice. You know, as you're aware, my slogan for my campaign and my way I kind of look at my election and what the people elected me to do, it's from God to us, life and liberty. And I've really focused on issues of liberty, giving people an opportunity to make choices, to own their own healthcare decisions, to own their own education decisions, and allow them the freedom to choose, which I think in the long run will save money.
Absolutely. And the whole idea behind the telehealth thing, I think is fantastic. When you think about, I mean, you know, when you think about the last time you've been to the doctor, you know, a lot of times, you know what you got. You know, you know, oh gosh, okay, I've got another sinus infection or something like that, and but you've got to kind of go through the.
Yeah, and you know what it is, Paul? It's allowing people to practice their craft, their profession, to the full extent of their license. And if they are trained, if we got nurses over here at ASU that's training them, and they can go to another state and be allowed to practice to the full scope of their licensure, they should be allowed to do that in Arkansas. And Arkansas just is much more restrictive on many, many healthcare choices. You know, it's very unusual for our hospitals to compete against each other. And what does that do to price? That causes prices to go up.
Yeah.
Those and same thing in education. You know, until we have a good, competitive, free market in education and allow educational choice and allow people, you know, the Bible talks about the first responsibility, or one of the responsibilities of parents is their child's education. And the parent is responsible for that. Our Constitution talks about that also, about parents and families being responsible for education. And right now their choices are limited. So we're going to try. I know some things will come up this session.
I was about to go into school choice, you know, because if we flash back a couple of years ago, it was Jim Dotson's bill, right?
Yes.
So he had a bill that was a school choice oriented bill, but it was pretty limited, you know, considering what I think a lot of people want to see eventually come out of school choice. But it was a good bill. It was.
I'm sure some people disagreed with you.
Well,
on that.
No. Yeah,
it got
right.
scaled way back.
Yeah, okay.
You know, we started out being a little more offering great choice and giving a kind of a pilot program. Then it got scaled back and eventually didn't pass. You know, I have a meeting tomorrow that I think is one of the preeminent people in our state on school finance. I think she's listening now. But I'm going to meet with her to learn more about the overall how our schools are funded and where the money needs to go and how difficult the bureaucracy has become in funding our schools and getting the money where it needs to go.
Yeah.
It's just incredible how difficult it is. And a lot of it is not state regs. A lot of it is federal regs. You know, in order to get the money, you have to jump through the hoops. And jumping through the hoops costs a lot of money. And it's just very bureaucratic and very complex. I know a little bit about it, having been a former educator, but I need to really dive down into the cost side and where the money goes and what we can do to get money to our teachers. A lot of people would be surprised at how much discretion our school boards have. You know, and I've asked many of the teachers, and I hope you have a lot listening, and people, our general population, they need to go to their school board meetings. You know, people need to engage locally and find out what their school board knows and what their school board what the choices that the school board has and what they're doing with their state's money.
Yeah. You know, and on the school choice subject, back to that bill, it ended up being controversial because you did have the, I guess, these entrenched education forces. You know, a lot of superintendents across the state were warning. They're saying this is a bad bill and everything else. And I know that you had several public forums or a couple public forums where, you know, you were not afraid to just engage and talk about the ideas I think some people weren't even wanting to listen to those ideas, and so we may have some of those obstacles again, right?
Absolutely, and I think it's a good thing to listen to people. It's a good thing to have those forums, and I'm always willing. I'm always willing to engage our public and engage our people in any issues that they're concerned about. That's why I'm meeting tomorrow with someone who's an expert in the funding formula.
Yeah.
And I look forward to the debate. I think it's a good debate, and it's what our Constitution calls for.
Yeah. Well, and this is an issue that certainly is in the Republican platform. And it's also something that originally it was interesting how it was a bipartisan thing. If you look at the movement, the school choice movement across the country, originally it was something where you had Democrats who were saying, listen, the inner cities need more choice.
Yeah, Paul, it's very similar in a smaller way to what's going on in the national scene. It's not about right and wrong. It's about who wins and who loses politically. And I can't allow my opponent to have a political win. That's what we're seeing on the national scene now. Everybody agrees on border security. Everybody agrees on those kind of issues, but people don't want people to have a win. And I think that's a little bit similar to what's going on in Arkansas politics. We have to be careful about who wins and who loses, and the constituents then become a secondary issue.
Yeah,
and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and then it just makes people get frustrated with, well, nothing gets done, and then they disconnect, and they're like, well, it doesn't matter. You talk about people getting involved locally. A lot of people get jaded, Dan, and they think, well, it doesn't matter who is in office because it's not, my life's not really going to change either way, and that's not true. That's just not true.
You're exactly right, and I really wish our constituents would get engaged. A great example of that, Paul, is the Patriots of Act 746.
Yeah.
Started out as just a very small group of people who really got engaged. And now, what are there, 13 or 15,000
17,000 last time I looked.
17,000 people engaged in that group, and now they have branched out into a new freedom.
Yeah, the Arkansas Liberty Coalition.
Liberty Coalition, and now that's growing. So it's an excellent example of what can happen on the local level when just a few people have the passion to be energized and re-engage with their government. And it starts at the local level.
Well, so tell me about that. You've been to some of the meetings, right? The Patriots Act 746 meetings.
Absolutely.
They invite legislators there. What do you think about the material that's being presented?
Well, I'm fully supportive. I mean, one of the things it does for me as a legislator, it gives me people that I can talk to who are experts in areas where I'm not an expert. And the people that are leading that group, if I have questions about what they believe and what they're not, about their knowledge level on a specific issue, I have someone to call. And then I have a larger group that I can go get feedback from and see what that constituency feels like. It's not a lot different than the group I met with of teachers at Brookland High School 2 years ago on the school choice issue. It was an opportunity to sit down and talk with people, whether you agree or disagree. We represent the people of our district.
Yeah.
And you can't represent them well if you don't know what their beliefs are.
Yeah. And just to clarify, when it comes to 746 and us being a constitutional carry state, you're on board with that.
Absolutely agreed. And matter of fact, I'm sure there's gun legislation in the works right now. People want to talk about restoration of their gun rights. I have a constituent who wrote a hot check when they were 19 or 20, and 30 years later, here they are. It was a felony. It was nonviolent, didn't hurt anybody else, but now 30 years later, they can't go hunting. And they would like to see legislation on restoration of those rights. And although federal law prohibits that on a federal level, state law can allow that to happen. Right now it happens if the governor decides to pardon someone, they can apply for a pardon, but that's kind of a political issue.
Yeah.
And, and I'm sure that all the governors, Governor Hutchinson and governors that preceded him, you have to consider what the ramifications are as you do that. Whereas if it's laid down in statute, it's much more clear cut and kind of takes the political angle out. So, there are a lot of things like that, opportunities to allow people to have freedom and be engaged and follow what our Constitution says.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but also a big issue down there is going to be tax cuts, revenue generation, and revenue neutral or not revenue neutral. You hearing anything?
Well, we have I've got a little booklet that the Farm Bureau puts out a booklet on what their position is. Other groups put out, what their positions are. We'll just have to get down there and see what the budget looks like. I think, you've mentioned it several times on the show. The bottom line is the bottom line. And when the end of the day comes and when the end of the year comes, is government growing or is government shrinking? And I personally am going to try to do my part as one of 130 to reduce spending by reducing some of the expenditures that we have that are just not necessary. And if each one of us could find a few programs that maybe passed 10 years ago, and we're still generating reports on top of report on top of report, and nobody uses the information, then let's start to shrink what our overall costs are. And although it's not much, it kind of stops the growth trend and starts us getting a whole new frame of reference on what our jobs are as legislators. It's not to go down there and pass, not only to go pass legislation, but to get rid of legislation that's just not not useful or not saving the state money. Every piece of legislation that we have, whether it does anything or not, costs us taxpayer dollars. And there's a lot of legislation on the books that we've had on there for years that we just track and it just mounts up and costs us money. Not a lot, but we need to set a different trend and a different mindset for legislators.
State Representative Dan Sullivan, glad you're going back down there to Little Rock,
Matter
sir.
of fact, I'm leaving right now to head down there.
Well, safe travels.
Thank you, Paul.
All righty, folks, we're going to take a break. Back in just a moment.